Good afternoon, everyone. I am Ann Meeker. I'm Deputy Director of POPVOX Foundation. I am a former caseworker, a former casework director, and I am so delighted to have to see everyone here. Thank you, as always, for joining us for the next in our Casework Navigator series. Today, we are kicking off a really exciting series of special casework webinars focused on helping you understand how the technical infrastructure of agencies shows up in your casework, how proposed and happening right now changes to that agency backend shows up in kind of the front end that your constituents see, and to kind of give you some extra support, extra knowledge, extra language to help chase these constituent inquiries through agencies and make sure that you are as prepared as possible in this rapidly changing moment. So the inspiration for this series really came out of some of the chaotic months earlier this year when I know caseworkers were right in the middle of rapid agency changes. And offices on both sides of the aisle were trying to figure out what do they mean in terms of casework. And around that time, I had the incredible good fortune and pleasure to be connected to Dana Chisnell, our partner and our co-host for this series. Dana served as the first head of customer experience for the Department of Homeland Security, under which FEMA, our agency for today, falls, and was part of the founding cohort for the U.S. Digital Service, and focused on immigration. She is now at Bloomworks, a women-owned digital services company helping governments improve digital services, which obviously speaks to our hearts at POPVOX Foundation as a women-owned and women-led team working on helping fix Congress and make Congress work better. So lots in common. So this series will focus on bringing former agency staff together with civil service organizations, with legislative staffers, to really break that down. How are agencies' digital services put together? How are they changing? And what does all of that mean for you? And so today, just in time for the start of hurricane season, we are kicking off with a deep dive into FEMA. This is an issue area that we've thought a lot about at POPVOX Foundation. I know some of you may have seen, I'm going to drop it in the chat, our report that came out last year on casework in disasters, the recommendations for how Congress can help strengthen agencies' ability to respond to constituents, respond to casework inquiries in and during disasters. So kind of lots of through lines from our work here. And we have an absolutely incredible panel of experts joining us today. So I will do very quick introductions and then turn it over to Dana for a more in-depth introduction and framing. But today we are so grateful to be joined by Chris Fromann, who's the Senior Counselor to the Administrator at FEMA, Logan Delabar Hayes, Professional Staff for the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure Majority, and Lauren Gross from House T&I Minority. And Lauren will join us a little bit later, but they are here and we're excited to have their expertise. So run of show for today, we're going to start with some framing remarks from Dana. We will go through Chris's presentation on helping you understand the process for FEMA, and then we will wrap up with a short presentation from Logan and Lauren on what's going on at the House FEMA, the FEMA Act discussion draft, and how you all as caseworkers can contribute to that process with your expertise serving constituents in disasters. So Dana, before we dive in, let me turn it over to you for general framing and then have you introduce Chris.
Well, thank you, Anne. It's such a delight to get to do this, connecting the front end to the back end, the executive branch to the legislative branch is pretty great. So as you alluded to, public services these days are digital services. And even if a member of the public comes to federal government services in person in a field office or say a disaster recovery center, like Chris will probably talk about a little bit today, every touch point is actually underpinned by technology. So I was really excited to kick off this series with POPVOX after my time working in the executive branch to help connect what happens in what you're seeing come through your caseload to what's happening inside at an agency HQ. I'm hoping that we can demystify some of those crucial services and help you and your constituents help yourselves and help your constituents even better than you do today. So we're hoping to help you as caseworkers figure out what might be happening in those cases, and also how you can contribute to efforts to streamline and improve agency programs from your own experiences. And so today, I'm delighted to introduce you to Chris Fromann. Chris is a technology and strategy expert with a career spanning public service, political technology, and consumer-facing products with tens of millions of users. He also was an early member of the U.S. Digital Service. Most recently, Chris served as counselor to the administrator at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, focusing on technology modernization and more effective delivery of digital services. In this role, he advocated for and built, which was not an easy thing to do, an in-house cross-functional digital service team from scratch. He shifted the redesign of survivor-facing disaster assistance portal to center around users instead of around the bureaucracy, and kicked off a multi-year effort to modernize the individual assistance backend, which desperately needs it, and co-authored the agency customer experience strategy, which is one of the best in the federal government. His tenure at FEMA concluded in early 2025. And so, Chris, I hand it to you now to bring your wisdom. Thanks for coming today.
Well, Dana, thank you so much for the kind introduction, and Anne and PopVox for including me. Very excited to be here, and I really appreciate you extending the invitation. Let me just share my screen really quickly. So, if you could advance to my background really quickly. Dana really covered this, so I'm not going to go into detail, but essentially, I've hopped back and forth between the private and public sector, most recently building digital service capacity at FEMA, and prior to that was in the private sector, most recently at Lyft, building that mapping experience team there. So if you've used Lyft in the last 6 years or so, we replaced the mapping experience there from using Google Maps to an in-house built product. So let's skip ahead to slide 3. And I'm going to be trusting that you're all seeing what I am not. So what I want to emphasize today is we're really talking about the status quo, and as caseworkers, how to navigate the status quo, right? We probably in the Q&A period will get into a discussion of how things could and should change. But right now we're dealing with the facts on the ground, and the limitations of the systems, the policies, the procedures as they basically exist today. We've alluded to front ends and back ends, and I just really quickly want to distinguish between the two and really what we're talking about. When we're saying front end, we're describing what a survivor is going to be seeing when they apply for disaster assistance online through the FEMA portal through disasterassistance.gov. That property has gotten a lot of investment in time and energy. It still has a long way to go, but in terms of like ease of use and plain language and only asking the questions that are relevant to your situation, we've made a bunch of improvements during my tenure, and they're continuing to try to move the ball forward there. The back end, that is what FEMA sees, the caseworkers on that side, hasn't really is a 26-year-old system, and hasn't been substantially modernized in that entire period of time, and has kind of had just functionality built on top of it, with no real overhaul to speak of. And so there are a lot of limitations that come from that backend system, and that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about and a lot of what we're going to be navigating today. So, so when we look at the application, so the next slide, what really survivors, what you should counsel survivors to do is select any systems they think they might be eligible for. FEMA sometimes uses kind of scary language to discourage people from from committing fraud, which is understandable, right? We obviously don't want we don't want to be sending money that folks shouldn't be receiving. But sometimes goes a little bit too far in terms of discouraging applicants from taking advantage of the things that they need and deserve, right? So FEMA is going to check whether or not you are ultimately eligible for it, but you have to apply for it up front in order to even be considered, right? There's a good example of this. There are two places that medical needs might come up, and it's best to select both and really let FEMA make the determination about what you should be receiving. And obviously, the language, is somewhat intimidating, and it's helpful, of course, for you all to guide survivors through that. That's the first thing. The second is document everything. The agency often asks for proof that later on that you weren't necessarily asked for upfront. So make sure that you're guiding survivors to take photos, keep receipts, really document everything. The third one is really, really important, and I can briefly explain why this is the case, but use the online portal whenever possible. So this means going to disasterassistance.gov rather than going into a disaster recovery center to add documentation, to add those photos and receipts that we talked about in the previous point. And if you go into a DRC, asking the FEMA staff there to help you upload it on their phone or through some other means. The thing is, if a survivor submits their documentation to the DRC, it gets transferred through so many different mediums, including fax. In 2025, things are faxed at one step of the process, and they lose a lot of the quality, right? So I've seen cases where over the course of 6 or 8 weeks, a survivor will come in to try to scan, try to submit their driver's license. And the same photo, or rather the same quality scan is reproduced 4 times spanning 6 or 8 weeks, and it's completely illegible. Completely useless. And so not only is that documentation completely useless, but the gap between when they submit that documentation and find out it's illegible is considerably longer. Again, 7 to 10 and sometimes even longer, 7 to 8 days and sometimes even longer than that. So really can't emphasize enough, any and all supporting documentation should be submitted online, either with your help or with the help of a staff member at the DRC, with the survivor explicitly asking, can you help me use this online portal? This is as good place as any to emphasize that 70% of survivors start their application online, but a considerably lower percentage finish it, right? So people are running into problems along the way and giving you all a call or going into DRC because they don't understand something, because they can't finish it, because they can't figure something out. So whenever possible, carrying through that process will help them get assistance much faster. So that's on the survivor side in terms of giving guidance. On the staff side, what I strongly encourage you to fill out the applications yourselves as caseworkers up to the point of submission, right? You don't want to submit a false application for disaster assistance, but you can get almost the entire way and understand the process and understand the questions that they're seeing prior to submission, right? And that'll give you an understanding of exactly what kind of questions and what they're going through. Finally, really look to help survivors interpret these questions. And want to be clear, we're not suggesting you should be providing any sort of legal advice. These questions are often written at they're complex, they're esoteric, and they're written at not an appropriate grade level. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we're actively working or actively worked to improve that, but not all of them are great still. And so what we're basically asking or suggesting rather is that you make sure that those questions are I'll say grade level appropriate when they're not. So that's the application. Let's shoot over to the next slide. And this talks about basically our communication to the public. FEMA letters have long been a source of frustration, and I'll tell you internally, frustration between individual assistants, staff members, and lawyers, right? Who obviously, or perhaps not obviously, have sometimes different takes on what is important or what is necessary to include. This is another area where we spent a fair amount of energy and effort to improve things, but the survivor letters, and these are letters and emails, that's how we communicate with survivors. They're too long, they're too dense, they're too confusing. I think the latest letter requesting additional information is still 4.5 pages long, which is daunting, right? The letters are also an amalgamation of different, what we call them, letter parts, right? So there are not 10,000 variants of letters. There are dozens of letter parts that are then assembled together, depending on your particular situation. And so sometimes you get things that are seemingly different tones or conflicting, which is obviously jarring to a survivor. So these things are pretty long and dense. So when you're, survivors often see something that sounds like a denial. You are not awarded money today, right? And they stop reading because, again, this is 4.5 pages. People are stressed. They're not, they're just looking to rebuild their lives, not read, 4.5, 5 pages of legalese. The problem is that it's usually not actually denial. What it is saying is that you are not eligible with the information that you've provided, with the documentation you provided thus far. We cannot give you this assistance. If you provide these 3 or 4 additional things or 1 additional thing, we can continue processing your application. So don't take no for an answer, and review closely the contents of the letter itself. Even if it is a denial, it's usually not a final, or rather, the final decision can be appealed, right? So in almost any case, the survivor has an additional path to get that assistance that they're looking for. So if we can go to the next slide. Some miscellaneous tips that are useful for you to know and to pass on. Inspections are really important. Survivors shouldn't miss them and should look closely for documentation or communication rather about appointments and scheduling appointments. Sometimes it's easy to miss. As I said, we send it via email and we send via mail, but we send it once, right? So make sure that it's not classified as spam. The case will not move forward without the inspection. They're critically important. If a survivor has insurance, even if it doesn't cover everything, they need to file a claim as soon as possible. FEMA will not give out any funds until you have either an insurance denial or insurance that doesn't cover all of your losses. And then finally, this probably doesn't come as a surprise, congressional inquiries are prioritized. It's different staff. It's a different queue. The sheer act of you inquiring on a constituent's behalf is going to get more attention to a particular case. We can have a long discussion about whether that's right or not, but it is the reality. So, going to, the congressional staff coming to FEMA is going to result in faster processing because it's just in a different queue. So those are kind of the tips for navigating the status quo with the systems that we have today. We emphasized, I know a lot, the digital side of things, but as I was mentioning, the majority of folks are entering this process certainly on the digital side. If obviously during disaster, people might not have cell phone service, they might have lost their devices. Obviously, in those cases, they have to go into a disaster recovery center. Even when that's the case, again, the documentation, whenever possible, should be submitted electronically. If that means using a library computer, if that means borrowing a computer, the unfortunate reality is it will just go much faster for them if they're submitting as much of this as possible online. So that's kind of the overview. I'll pass it back to you, Anne, and thank you so much for helping me through these technical difficulties. And then excited to start the conversation and dive deeper into any areas that folks on the call want to ask questions about.
Perfect. Chris, that was so fascinating. Thank you for sharing, I think, really helpful perspective for caseworkers on kind of the why behind the inquiries that they might be getting. That I think is really, really helpful. And thank you for your patience with technical difficulties. We appreciate it.
Absolutely.
So let me just flag too. So caseworkers, we have so much time. We have a lot of time for Q&A. So please use the Q&A function, flag for us whatever might be helpful. We will definitely try to get to as many questions as possible. And a few that I wanted to start out with, and Dana, Lauren, and Logan, please feel free to jump in as well if there's anything else that you flagged or questions on your mind. One thing I really wanted to ask was, so you mentioned a couple of issues where in your former position at FEMA, you were kind of aware of these common customer service issues, and it sounded like some of them may have been out of your control on either things that were mandated by Congress or things that were coming through the legal department. How do you think about kind of dividing those issues into buckets for like things that can be solved with better investment and better tools on the back end for versus things that would require Congress to step in and sort out? Is there like a process for identifying the stuff that should get sent back over to Congress within FEMA?
Does anyone want to start, or anyone want me to take that one?
Um, I can give a little bit of insight on this. So a lot of the work that we did at the Department of Homeland Security through customer experience and making things more efficient, more effective, was really around connecting and communicating with the public through and around public services. Worked really closely with our attorney partners in the Office of General Counsel and with the Office of Legislative Affairs. And so I got the pleasure of briefing a number of committee staff, which I really enjoyed, and largely because staff came well informed about what we were trying to do and how we were trying to do it. Um, and so every now and then there would be a chance for us to give technical assistance on proposed bills. And it was very helpful to get to see those things ahead of time. Um, in the day-to-day work, though, 99% of that happens administratively uh, through designing and delivering digital services, through process improvements, through working through call centers to understand what the data looks like on the questions that people are asking, and turning that into better services and better processes. And Chris did a lot of that at FEMA. One of the things that comes to mind for me is you talked about the letters and notifications, Chris, and I know that at one point there was a plan to take that on in a serious way uh, to turn those into plain language and make them more actionable. And I wonder, were you able to make any progress? And what kind of help would you need from the legislative branch to move that forward faster if you were inside now?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything you said, and especially the point about most of it is around administration, regulation, and really prioritizing a customer experience centered approach. Um, you know, from So most of it is within the ability of the executive branch to change. There just needs to be a will to do so. Um, we haven't really talked at a high level what customer experience is. We can dig into that if folks are confused or need clarification. But I'll say that it has been, or it certainly in the last 10 plus years has been a bipartisan priority. There have been EOs issued under both Democratic and Republican presidents. In the first Trump administration, there were several EOs surrounding improving customer experience. So in terms of what I think the legislative branch can do, basically, even not legislatively, just signal that improving uh, that focusing these experiences around survivors, around constituents, around the people, and not around bureaucracy is critically important. Um, there's a long trail of well-intentioned legislation that attempts to put these things very explicitly into law, and it tends to backfire. Um, so I would caution necessarily against being too prescriptive there. Um, but certainly saying that it is, that, for example, that digital services need to be tested with members of the public, with the actual customers they are targeting. That is still a radical idea in some places, and it needs to not be, right? So, Dana, you alluded to this effort to improve the letters. The problem is there isn't a single effort to improve letters. We've done this at FEMA at least 4 times in the last, predating me. The last effort was, kicked off in the fall and never concluded. But the problem is it gets just tied up um, in internal battles between the lawyers and the program experts, and doesn't necessarily get out to the people who are actually going to be using the thing, which is the critical part, right? To actually put it in front of survivors, and get that feedback loop and understand that it is basically unusable by the public, and that needs to be, unacceptable.
So it would be really helpful for caseworkers who are getting these kinds of complaints about, I got this letter, I don't understand what this says, to surface that to your agency partners.
Perfect.
And explicitly what points that folks find confusing, right? I don't understand this paragraph or this sentence and this language, and really highlight that confusion.
Perfect. And Logan, I see you popped in. Do you have something to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to derail unnecessarily, but I mean, for the benefit of the caseworkers on the call, my name's Logan. I'm a PSM with the majority. My colleague Lauren is on the call as well. We've been really trying to work through this question of dealing with the fact that many of FEMA's systems are, at least on the back end, very compliance oriented. Chris, I think we're kind of coming at it from the Congress angle. But we did work on a bipartisan piece of legislation called the FEMA Act, and the IA section does deal, I think, pretty clearly with the issue of FEMA denials, with the way that FEMA handles insurance, and I think notably with the development of a common application, a thing that I remember from my time in the Louisiana delegation, where disasters are all too rampant, is that people really struggle having to deal with a FEMA application, an SBA application, and then sometimes years down the line resurfacing all that paperwork again for an application to HUD for CDBGDR funding. And a common application is something that GAO has recommended, the Government Accountability Office has recommended for a long time. The agencies have come back and shared that they don't have the information sharing authority that is necessary for them to actually develop it. And so, on a bipartisan basis, we've done some really great work in pulling together a proposal that gives them the authority and signals, I think, that Congress is really interested. And Chris, I've been taking notes. I mean, I think some of the language that, from a practical perspective, there's tech speak too, right? And testing against kind of the basic human that would actually be interacting with the system is a good flag for us. So our draft is in the discussion phase. We can kind of come back to this, but thoughts like this in general are really helpful, because we are really interested in getting FEMA to a place where it can better serve the public. And sometimes that's about aligning expectations, and sometimes that's about maybe giving FEMA the authority or direction it needs to take these steps.
Yeah, Logan, I'll just not to take too much time on this, but trying to move forward in the Common App was a big priority of ours in the previous administration. What derailed that, I think, was a lack of interest from other parties, from other agencies. So, obviously things are quite different at FEMA now, and the future is a bit uncertain. So support for that might need to be shored up on the FEMA side as well. But certainly 6 months ago, there was actually a U.S. Digital Service team working on that exact challenge. I think 1 or 2 people might still be there working on that. But yeah, it was really the bigger struggle was getting folks in other agencies to engage, and in good faith to kind of move that forward.
Perfect. Really helpful, y'all. And we are definitely going to come back to the FEMA Act at the end here and really talk about what's going on there and how can caseworkers kind of contribute from their expertise. But really appreciate the discussion. I think it's actually really rare for us in these webinars that we feel like we have all of the components of the policy feedback loop, right? Where we have folks who are at the agency implementing policy. We have folks in the committee who's in charge of developing that policy and getting it through the political process. And then the caseworkers who kind of catch the constituent feedback on that implementation and have the ability to kind of bring it back up through the agency and then also back to the committee when there are things where Congress needs to step in and continue to be involved in that ongoing oversight and implementation work. So I wanted to highlight that again is why this today is really special, and it's really exciting to kind of get to talk through how these pieces fit together. And then specifically on how those pieces fit together, Chris, you mentioned something I wanted to pick up on, which is that congressional inquiries get routed through a different process at FEMA. Can you walk us through just so when caseworker hears from constituent and sends in an inquiry on an individual assistance case, what happens on the back end? Where does that go? Who handles it? Where do we learn from?
So this I can't go into too much detail, but so you have there are two different types of staffers we're talking about, right? The staffers that you as congressional caseworkers are interacting with, and then there are folks who are actually processing the cases themselves. And so the thing I want to emphasize is, so these are, first of all, they're two different people, right? The congressional liaisons are not the same people who are reviewing applications for for completion and for supporting documentation and so on and so forth. What I mentioned earlier and would emphasize now is the simple act of reaching out to your congressional liaison gets the case put in a different queue, worked on by a different set of, or rather, it's not a different set of folks, but prioritized differently within these systems, right? So every day, when a FEMA caseworker comes into the office, they have a prioritized queue of cases they need to look at over the course of their day, and essentially that congressional inquiry will say bump up. So the folks that the staffers talk to will forward on the information and essentially bump up the priority of the case. So that is also why when you're talking to the congressional liaison, they're not going to have a ton of information necessarily about the case, right? They don't necessarily have that access. What they have done is they have forwarded on the priority. The other thing to note is, let's talk about the documentation example again, right? If someone goes into a DRC and submits a, insurance denial letter or something like that, if you submit that in the DRC, for those 7 or 10 days, the document essentially goes into a black hole, right? I cannot get the status of that until that has been, I'll say, interpreted, right? So it gets emailed and then faxed and then scanned. Like the process is Kafkaesque, but I'm not going to have visibility even as on the staff side into where that is, or even necessarily that you submitted it. So if a survivor calls the say the 1-800 number, they're going to be asked, well, when did you submit it? Oh, you should just wait another week and then call back, right? So again, going back to do not submit documentation manually at our DRC because there's no visibility into the process. And to go back to that question, there's also because of that, there's even if they had access, the congressional liaison could not provide information about the status, say, of documentation being added to a case.
Again, super helpful. And I only worked with FEMA directly when I was doing casework on floodplain insurance cases, but for other agencies, it's one of the most frustrating response you can possibly get back that says, hey, the constituent needs to resubmit their documentation, or we have it, but we don't know where it is. So I think it's really helpful to kind of hear why that it is not just sitting on someone's desk while they get a coffee break. Like there is a technical reason for why that kind of documentation takes so long. That feels really helpful to understand.
Yeah, as I said, the backend system is 26 years old. It is not a CRM. It is not a customer relationship management system. the document is not uploaded through that single system where that source of truth where you'd be able to see it. This is a ton of different pipes that are not well connected together, and do not have a lot of visibility, and different parts of the agency are touching.
Got it. And then again, the other piece about what the congressional liaison can see and can't see also feels really, really helpful for just thinking about the responses casework folks are getting back from the liaison. And you mentioned that they're prioritized differently. Do you have a sense for if something else we've talked about for caseworkers, that caseworkers are really good at finding like the edge cases, the weird cases, the policy cases that may not be kind of the standard cases
Mhm.
coming through a big program. Is there any process for on the agency side for kind of learning from casework inquiries? Is there any kind of report? Who sees that report? How are those processed?
You mean in terms of, oh, I'm highlighting this odd edge case?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not that I'm aware of. I think that so another challenge with this system, you kind of alluded to this, there's a lot of both legal and regulatory complexity. It takes, I think what was quoted like 24 months, so like basically 2 years for someone to become competent in evaluating a case on the FEMA side. This is deeply problematic for a lot of reasons. This is not unique to FEMA, right? Social Security experiences something similar. But people need a lot of training to become experts in these, or not even experts, but like able to handle casework on their own. And so, that's obviously a staffing challenge. It's staffing and retention challenge. It's the way that we've designed the systems is very human resource intensive. So what people do, they're not necessarily, at least to my knowledge, sharing cases that have been highlighted by congressional caseworkers, but they are internally sharing, and also building up their own knowledge repository about these kind of edge cases that they've seen over time. And the caseworkers do they have a daily meeting, and they talk and they communicate about cases. Whether that shows up in a report or not, I am unaware.
Yeah, to add on to that, I will say that of course, the processes are different internally to different agencies, so your mileage may vary. If you're not calling about uh, a disaster survivors case at FEMA, but you are calling Customs and Border Protection, or you're calling U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, they have different processes for tracking congressional cases. Uh, some are some are better supported than others. And so as we go through this series, you'll get to hear more about some of those exactly. But there are a lot coming back to your points, Chris. It seems like one of the challenges internally to FEMA is the person who does the intake on that case from constituent services, A, doesn't have insight to what the case status is, and B, when they find the person who does, the systems are not all connected well, and
Yes,
it takes some manual work to actually put the picture together.
exactly.
Again, really helpful. And actually, so Chris and Dana, you both mentioned this, and I'd love to circle back to it just for a little bit more framing and context here. So both of you were in roles looking at CX in the federal government. And as you said, this is part of like a long-term strategy across administrations and kind of focus on that constituent experience. Can you just talk a little bit more about how CX teams work and how they might be connected into or not into ledge affairs and into showing back up in casework?
Sure. I'll talk from the HQ point of view and then hand it off to you, Chris. So we created a customer experience team in the headquarters for the Department of Homeland Security, largely to develop and support the building of teams within each of the operating components at the department. That's where the work gets done. And our job is really around awareness, support, and we also ran a bunch of hiring actions that we shared across the department. So trying to get some efficiencies there. We worked very hard to build a community among customer experience leads in the operating components and to make sure that they knew who their CFO was, they knew who their Office of Legit Affairs was, they knew who the head of the OGC was. And so that they considered them part of their team. Because they are, whether you take them into account or not, right? Because you do end up partnering with them at some level. And so we built some of those relationships and also shared those relationships internally to those agencies. But the culture and the org chart of every single one of those operating components is different one to the next. And that's where somebody like Chris who comes in to further build those relationships and connect the importance of each of those partners in delivering better customer service and better customer experience.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by saying, this is an effort that has been, 12 to 15 years in the making, starting with the Presidential Innovation Fellows, moving to US Digital Service and AT&F. There was a USDS contingent at DHS for quite a while, then evolving into a more permanent in-house presence with Dana's team, and then starting a permanent kind of US CX and digital service presence at FEMA. These efforts are only successful if we have leadership buy-in and pretty strong leadership support. So in my case, the administrator really cared about making the customer experience better. This is my fifth, maybe sixth agency. When that was not the case in previous years, nothing moved forward, right? Because and Dana alluded to this is a really big culture change. And so shifting agencies to focus on customer outcomes and not regulatory compliance and internal operations is a gargantuan mental shift. So I'll start with that. Now, from there, it is really important to make the relationships across the agency, but I'm not. I want to emphasize the reason that the lawyers spoke to me and the policy folks spoke to me is because I was able to speak on behalf of the administrator and as one of her priorities, right? And this was also something the White House cared about, right? So we're trying to move a oil tanker. And it is a slow process, but it requires a lot of power to do so, and a lot of I'll say, executive support and political will.
That's a really important point. But I do want to say too, when I took on the job heading customer experience at DHS, a thing that I heard and saw across the department was that people who had been around, in some cases for decades, had been trying to do better in delivering services to the public and it wasn't necessarily part of their job, but they were reaching out to constituents to learn about their experience. They were working hard to understand what that was like and what needed to be changed. I also want to talk very briefly about the difference between customer service and customer experience. And so customer service is something that the federal government has focused on for a very long time. That is the emphasis of many of the early executive orders. And that is really about remedial action, right? And that is a lot of what you guys are doing as part of your casework, right? There's something broken in the system and you are having to manage that. That is sort of reactive, right? Whereas customer experience looks at what can we do to design the experience of public services so that they meet people where they are. And so by doing things like making disasterassistance.gov easier to use and easier to understand, making it available in multiple languages for people who are not speaking or reading English, for making it as plain language as possible for people who have low literacy. And believe me, even people with a master's degree are pretty low literacy when they've been hit by a disaster where their lives have been turned upside down. So those are some very basic sort of table stakes that go into this, but it all ripples back into what happens in the back of the house, in the back offices, in the back office systems.
Yeah, I mean, you make such a number of wonderful points there. I'll follow up on the first thing that you said, Dana, which is, these ideas, I said this has been, 15 years in the making. These ideas are rarely new, right? Someone in the agency has thought about them and just haven't had the support to do something about it. I was so impressed when I came to FEMA that there was this grassroots community of practice around customer experience, people who's were pushing and advocating and being in the pain in the butt for better for better experiences for our customers. And they just weren't being enabled. I think this is a much bigger problem in terms of the incentive structure in government, right? We do not incentivize people based on delivery of results to customers, to survivors. We incentivize risk avoidance, and we incentivize, especially to middle management, all of these things that are really in conflict with delivering better services, right? Because what I've seen often is, you have this grassroots community this grassroots group that wants to do better. They don't necessarily have the training or the verbiage, but they figure it out. They read as much as they can, and they advocate as effectively as they can. And then you have pretty senior executives in the SES who sometimes know that things need to be better. I think it's really about changing the incentive structure for your frontline 13, 14, 15 managers, and some SES who have been doing who are a little too focused on the status quo.
Definitely. Perfect. And just to kind of reframe this, so I want to again emphasize that, so I know for a lot of caseworkers here, this is going to feel a little bit high level for the work that you do when you're in the weeds doing this kind of one-on-one individual support to work with your constituents. But again, I think helpful, and we've said this for ages, that caseworkers really do have that same kind of granular in the weeds. We know where the problems are, and also have kind of a unique point of leverage to kind of sell where those problems are to the agencies through your actual casework, and then also connect into the legislative process and say, hey, where does Congress need to be telling the agencies to do better here, or to try something different, or to reemphasize, reprioritize something. And so for our last 10 minutes, I think that is a perfect jumping off point to talk to Lauren and Logan about what's going on with the FEMA Act. Because I think this is, as we're talking about those kind of leverage points and where can caseworkers plug in that really deep expertise. And I love that framing between customer service and customer experience. I think that connection is really where caseworkers shine. So I'll just talk a little bit about the FEMA Act and about the process of putting out a discussion draft. And y'all, what is helpful for you guys to hear from caseworkers? Over to you.
Logan, do you want me to kick it off?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So last month, we were able to publish a discussion draft of our bipartisan FEMA reform bill here on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And so this really was intended to be a holistic look at FEMA of, we know that the agency isn't perfect. How can we make it better? How can we improve outcomes for disaster survivors? And right, it touches on things from making FEMA an independent agency, reforming the public assistance program, improving mitigation programs, oversight and accountability, but we also have a very substantial individual assistance section, which is what I'll focus on for this call, given you all are caseworkers, and that I know is, where you do the bulk of your work. So within that section, we do create a universal application for individual assistance, as Logan referenced. And then we try to be responsive to a lot of the issues that we've heard from folks over the years. So, we make it clear that, individuals don't have a fixed address to qualify for sheltering assistance. We, tell FEMA that they can't immediately issue a denial letter to survivors that mark that they have insurance on their application, right? They need to wait until an insurance determination has been made before issuing a denial or an acceptance, because we know that there's a lot of confusion there. We require FEMA to provide any documentation requested by the applicant in the event that they are trying to appeal their individual assistance decision. We also, do things to expand what sort of assistance is available to individuals, including, allowing FEMA to repair homes past the point of habitability. So up to that $42,500 cap if they have that, many repairs needed on their home. We allow FEMA to do direct repair on homes, and we even go so far as to say, in the event of total loss of a home, FEMA may replace the home if it's determined that that's more cost effective than doing a direct housing solution, right? So like a FEMA trailer for multiple months, that isn't going to be a permanent housing option. So really, we just tried to look at it and say, okay, like what makes sense for the survivor? What really is going to improve the experience here. But we are really at I would say 1,000-foot level when we're looking at what happens particularly with individuals after a disaster. And you all are the ones that have the direct contact and the direct stories and kind of know what those day-to-day frustrations are. And so if there's anything that you think that we've missed as you review the bill, and we'll actually go ahead and maybe try and drop a summary here in the chat after we finish presenting. Please do let us know, because we're in the discussion draft phase, which means that we are accepting feedback before we introduce the bill. And so we're actually going to start reviewing that feedback this week, and we would love to hear from you all. But I will now turn it over to my partner, Logan, if she has anything else she'd like to share.
Yeah, I mean, Lauren, I think you covered it. And, I will say that so much of this has come out of the direct experience of, members of Congress and their constituents in disaster impacted districts. And many of the things we seek to address in the bill, and I think a great example of that is the Common App. It's a place where we went to FEMA and, asked them if they had the authority to do it. And we were told that they did not. And so, we really took care here to not legislate in search of a problem, but really have a problem-focused bill, which seeks to alleviate some of the pressure that we know you guys face when you're actually trying to help people recover after a disaster, because there just is that perception gap, which is such a problem. Your constituents believe FEMA will be there to help. And, when they hear maybe that $750 is immediately available and it's not written in plain language, they're like, wait, I'm only eligible for $750. What is that going to buy me? And they're not seeing that $750 and other needs assistance is actually an incredible expansion of what is able to be provided without a home inspection through the Stafford Act. Their lived experience is more narrow, and they're bringing all of that to bear. And that, I think, is where you guys as caseworkers can both help your constituents, but also help us think through places where those frictions might arise. And then we can take those ideas, back to the agency, back to our writing desks, and figure out if, it's appropriate for a study, if it's appropriate for legislative drafting. And you don't have to have a solution. I mean, I think our email, and I'll drop in the chat the official email that we're using to collect bipartisan feedback, which goes to all of our inboxes on TNI. But if you've just got a problem and you're like, I don't know how to fix this, our inboxes are absolutely open. We're down to get creative, but our experiences are limited, and every disaster is different and has its own contours. So I'll drop that email now.
So helpful. And I can't emphasize again enough, for the caseworkers on this call, hearing directly from committee staff to say, hey, we recognize and value your expertise and your insight from working with constituents. Now hand that back to us as we have a bipartisan draft. Like this is a really cool opportunity, and I think emphasizes again how valuable your expertise as caseworkers is to fixing these problems. Again, we've heard from kind of folks on the inside the agency who are also trying to fix that, but we need, like Chris mentioned, like we need kind of everybody has to come together to demonstrate the willpower to fixing the issues that you guys see. So it was a really cool opportunity. For caseworkers who have limited legislative expertise and the process of contributing to this might sound intimidating. Can you just give me a little bit more info on just the format and the specifics? What are you looking for when folks reach out to that email address?
Yeah, it can be as simple. I'll use the example I always use when we talk, but when my former boss had a disaster in his district and we went around asking people for PRFs, they were like, my house flooded. How am I supposed to get you a PRF? And bringing us a problem like that is like completely sufficient. We are able to do the deep dive and be like, okay, like why is a PRF required? What's going on with the Privacy Act of 1974? What are the barriers to doing a digital form? What kind of identity verification would need to happen? How could we do that? Like we are capable of doing that work. But something as straightforward as, this is crazy. People have been through a disaster. Their home might have burned down. They don't have a printer. The Kinko is probably also burned down. How can we work through that? I think is like completely sufficient. If you're a caseworker and you happen to like share that you were in this panel with your counterpart on your legislative team. I mean, we used to work when I was an LD. We worked super closely with our caseworkers. It's where all of our best ideas came from in terms of problem solving. Maybe your boss has a bill and you just want to send it over to us. I mean, anything, any format is totally fine.
Beautiful. And again, that cheerleading is so helpful. We really appreciate that. Awesome. We are at time. So again, I just want to say an enormous thank you to Dana, Chris, Lauren, and Logan. This has been such a fascinating discussion and a little bit higher level, but really emphasizing the value of casework expertise, how casework expertise can drive efforts to reform things that are already happening within the agencies, how they can contribute to efforts that require complementary efforts happening on the legislative side. So, and a little bit of tactical, useful information as well for caseworkers on just, hey, what is going on when you submit an inquiry? So enormously helpful. Thank you all so much for your generosity with your time and expertise in joining us today. We really appreciate it. Casework folks, we have the second in this series. We'll be talking about SNAP on Friday. And then, as always, all of our resources are on our website at popvox.org. I'm dropping in the chat /casework. And I am always available if you have comments, questions, ideas for future webinars. I am at ann@popvox.org. And then we did record today and we will put the video up. That'll be at that first link later this week. Awesome. Thank you all again so much for your time today. Have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.